Hasn't science proved there's no God? Well, not quite. In fact, there are plenty of extremely brilliant scientists who have moved from atheism or agnosticism to theism because of their scientific discoveries, and plenty more who were theists to begin with, but more on that later. Listen, I have a deep appreciation for the sciences and for what the methods of science have accomplished for mankind through the centuries. But as important as science is, it's equally important to recognize that science does have inherent limitations. In the first place, we must acknowledge that the scientific method has limits. Specifically, it is virtually impossible to prove that something doesn't exist or to prove a universal negative. If your proof were to be based on scientific observation, you would have to claim that your scientific observations have led you to omniscience. Otherwise, it could be that the one thing you don't know is that God does exist. Secondly, if your proof were to be based on a conclusion derived from using the scientific method to examine the universe, you must be reminded that the scientific method is limited. It's limited to using natural means to study natural things, and it does so by manipulating natural variables to see natural results. You cannot use the scientific method to examine the supernatural or to come to proven conclusions about the supernatural. What does all this mean? Here's the bottom line. Science cannot be used to provide absolute proof that either God does not exist or that God does exist. We can certainly look for evidence of his existence in the natural world, which could lead to believing God's existence is the most reasonable explanation for what we observe. But neither belief nor disbelief in God can rest on absolute proof. Both must rest on a preponderance of the evidence. But here's a second observation for you to think about. If science has proved there is no God, many intelligent and prominent scientists do not know it. Dr. Henry F. Schaefer, an award-winning professor and researcher in theoretical chemistry, produced a book entitled Science and Christianity, Conflict or Coherence. His book is filled with examples of world-renowned scientists from the Renaissance to the present time who found no conflict between science and belief in God, but instead were persuaded that scientific investigation of the natural world actually testifies to God's existence. Here are a few key quotes from some of the most celebrated and respected scientists of all time who concluded that the scientific discoveries of the last 5 centuries, far from proving that God does not exist, provide overwhelming evidence for belief in God's existence as creator of this universe. Johannes Kepler said, "The chief aim of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics." Isaac Newton asks, "Did blind chance know that there was light, and what was its refraction, and fit the eyes of all creatures after the most curious manner to make use of it? These and such like considerations always have and ever will prevail with mankind to believe that there is a being who made all things and has all things in his power, and who's therefore to be feared. We're therefore to acknowledge one God, infinite, eternal, the creator of all things." Michael Faraday and James Clerk Maxwell, 19th century scientists who stand out as being among the greatest experimental and theoretical scientists of all time, were both men of deep faith in God. It is said of Faraday that had he lived into the era of the Nobel Prize, he would have been worthy of 8 Nobel Prizes. As the main architect of the classical field theory of electromagnetism, Faraday provided the foundational concept for Maxwell's mathematical field equations, which unified the physics of electricity, magnetism, and light as different aspects of one and the same phenomenon. At the end of his long and useful life, Faraday said, "I thank God that I don't rest my dying head upon speculations, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day." That's 2 Timothy 1:12. Maxwell served as the first Cavendish professor of physics at Cambridge University from 1871 until his death in 1879. At his request, the great oak doors opening onto the site of the original Cavendish laboratory had carved on them the Latin text of Psalm 111, verse 2, "The works of the Lord are great, studied by all who have pleasure in them. A grand testimony to Maxwell's strong faith in the author of the universe, who appointed laws both natural and moral for man to discover and obey. William Thomson, recognized as an influential physical scientist and one of the greatest science teachers of his time, was a strong believer in God and the Bible. In a speech to University College in 1903, he stated, "Do not be afraid of being free thinkers. If you think strongly enough, you will be forced by science to the belief in God." Alan Sandage was a student of Edwin Hubble and Walter Baade, an astronomer and cosmologist who came to be regarded by his peers as the preeminent observational cosmologist of his time. His research earned him the Crawford Prize, astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Though he was a lifelong agnostic and scientific materialist, he participated in a conference in February of 1985 discussing three big questions at the intersection of science and philosophy: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. The panels at the conference consisted of proponents of the atheistic and theistic worldviews. Professor Sandage caused quite a stir when he sat down at the theistic side of the panel on the origin of the universe. He and Professor Owen Gingerich, Harvard historian of science and astrophysicist, explained how advances in astronomy and cosmology established that the material universe had a definite beginning in time and space, suggesting a cause beyond the physical or material universe. They also discussed discoveries in physics showing how the universe had been finely tuned from the beginning of time to allow for the existence of complex life. This suggested to them some prior intelligence responsible for the fine-tuning. Both argued that the discovery seemed to fit much better with a theistic perspective than a materialistic one. Quotes from Dr. Sandage himself explain why he had recently embraced faith in God. "It was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It is only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence." And more recently, Dr. John Lennox has come to be known as a strong proponent of theism and Christianity specifically. Dr. Lennox is Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford and Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. He has debated many modern-day proponents of the new atheism, including Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Atkins, and Lawrence Krauss, and written extensively on the theme, "Has Science Buried God?" Dr. Lennox concludes his book, God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God?, with the following summarizing statements. As we saw in our last chapter, science has not and cannot eliminate the supernatural. Far from science having buried God, not only do the results of science point towards his existence, but the scientific enterprise itself is validated by his existence. Either human intelligence ultimately owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator. It is strange that some people claim that it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer the first to the second. In accord with the conclusions of these renowned scientists, I am convinced that it is more reasonable than ever to believe in God in this scientific age.